Javier Becerra, Chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, joined by our Vice Chairman, Joe Crowley, our Chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico, and our ranking member on the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Frank Pallone of New Jersey. I thank the two gentlemen, Mr. Lujan and Mr. Pallone, for joining us today. We had a caucus meeting today where we had our opportunity to discuss several subjects that are coming before this Congress of great importance. And perhaps the one that took some time and was a bit emotional was the tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina. And speaking of the families and the victims at Mother Emanuel AME Church, and our thoughts and prayers go out to the families. Many of us are planning to join in the services on Friday that will be held in Charleston. And many of us want to convey and have conveyed our deepest sympathies to the families who have been courageous and gracious in the way they've handled this tragedy. And we want to express to them our belief in the American spirit and the proof that they are American leaders in this country, showing us how to heal and move together as one American family. We know that within the next week, the Supreme Court will issue several decisions of great importance, not the least of which will be a decision on the Affordable Care Act. More and more it's becoming obvious that if the Supreme Court does not uphold the Affordable Care Act's provisions that provide tax credits to millions of Americans to be able to afford their health insurance, that there will be millions of these Americans who have, for the first time in many cases, had an opportunity to have insurance to pay for their kids' visit to the hospital or doctor, a chance of losing that insurance. And we hope that the Supreme Court does the right thing, interprets the law as it was meant to be interpreted, and that if by chance it moves in a different direction, that our Republican colleagues are prepared to move quickly to undo an injustice to millions of Americans who might lose their health insurance for their children and for themselves. We also have before us some bills that continue a trend which Republicans started with their support for the Sequester, which calls for these mindless, blinded, or blindfolded cuts to some of the most important services and programs that the federal government provides to Americans who pay their taxes, whether it's Head Start programs, whether it's food safety programs, whether it's Homeland Security Department programs. All of these are on the chopping block, and we think that it's time for our Republican colleagues to come sit down in a common sense way to reach common sense solutions on a bipartisan basis rather than do mindless, blind, meat axe approach budgeting on some of our most important programs. Mr. Pallone will talk about how some of our programs that protect our environment are principally at stake, and how legislation today may actually cause Americans to be less safe when it comes to their water and their air. Finally, I want to make sure we mention that many of us are still waiting for our jobs agenda here in Congress, that the Republican leadership would give us a chance to actually vote for jobs. Many of us are concerned that these trade bills that are coming before us will lose American jobs. It's about time we started talking about building an economy that creates more and more jobs for Americans. And we hope we have an opportunity soon to pass a full-fledged, long-term transportation funding bill that will allow our communities back home to deal with their infrastructure, which is deteriorating. One of every 3 bridges in Los Angeles is in disrepair. And we know we need to move quickly, so we need to pass a highway transportation funding bill that lets us get moving back again in creating those jobs that help us rebuild our bridges, fix our roads, build those schools, do all the things that we know help America be stronger and create more jobs. With that, let me now yield to the Vice Chair, Joe Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A shooting incident in a university, shooting incident in a public theater, then in a grammar school, and now at a house of worship. If the act that took place in South Carolina weren't horrific enough that it took place in a house of worship, a sanctuary, where people were praying to their God. It is struck at the heart of this country what took place in Charleston, and all of our hearts. It's not only an attack upon the African American community or that particular church, it's an attack upon all of us. And all the discussion about amendments to the Constitution, what about the right to freely associate? What about the right to worship your God? And to have that all taken away by a bullet is outrageous, to say the least. It's unacceptable. It is immoral. And the motivations that drove this particular person to act in the way that he did is something that has no place in American society. So our hearts go out to the people of Charleston, of South Carolina, but to the rest of the country as well, who are grieving because of the atrocities that took place there. So I want to thank the chairman as well as the caucus, and I want to thank the speaker and the leadership here in helping to provide members to attend the services if they so choose so this Friday. And I think there'll be a great contingency from the Congress to send a message to the country as well. These killings, these acts have no place in our society. Here, though, unfortunately, it's the same old, once again, a lack of vision, a lack of investment, a lack of meeting the aspirational needs of our country in the appropriations process. This week as well, defunding or not funding enough our national parks, not investing in what really has made America so unique around the world is the investment in our infrastructure, our national parks, as being part of that. As the chairman had mentioned, no mention of a jobs bill, no mention of fixing the highway trust fund, and not waiting to the last minute once again. I don't know if you all are a little tired of waiting for the last minute. It's not even exciting anymore. This brinksmanship. And really what is done is just the American people are looking at the Congress today and the Republican leadership is saying, what is this all about? I thought you're supposed to be down there to help the American people. Help us grow, help the country through investment. And none of that's happening right now. In fact, we see disinvestment. We're seeing a lack of investment, not only on public parks, but on our roads, our tunnels, our bridges. It's not meeting the expectations and the aspirations of the American people, and that needs to come to an end. The Republican leadership has to start doing things that speak to the American people and about the future of this country, and that we're willing to invest. We're willing to create jobs for Americans here at home and not simply outshore them to other parts of the world. It's about America first, everywhere else second. And I hope that message begins to trickle down or trickle up, depending how you look at it here in the House of Representatives. And with that, I'll turn it to the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Frank Pallone.
Thank you, John. Well, following up on what Congressman Crowley said, the American people are certainly not going to be helped by the Republican effort today to gut the EPA's Clean Power Plan. I wanted to mention, first of all, that every Democrat on the Energy and Commerce Committee voted against this bill when it came out of committee, and we're certainly urging all Democrats to vote against it today on the floor. The president issued a veto message, or basically actually saying outright that he would veto this bill if it comes to his desk. And the main point that was made in that message was the fact that this is going to be harmful to public health. In other words, the bottom line is that the EPA's Clean Power Plan is designed to try to protect the public from dirty air, from these emissions that would come from power plants. 2 points that were mentioned in the veto message and that I'll stress today. One is that actually the EPA's plan is only a proposal. This is probably the first time that I can remember where legislation is being brought by the GOP to the floor to negate a rule that hasn't even been finalized and won't be probably until the end of the year. The EPA has allowed a lot of opportunities for states to meet these standards and to comment on these standards and to have flexibility, but no actual rule has been finalized. So, the legislation says that the rule is postponed until any litigation is complete. So essentially it's saying, we're not going to have any rule as long as we continue to litigate. Another example of how the GOP just wants to litigate everything. In addition to that, the legislation says that the governors can opt out of the EPA rule when it is finalized. So it essentially says that no state has to even abide by the EPA's Clean Power Plan at all. So for this reason, for all these reasons, it makes no sense to support this legislation. It's just an outright effort to gut a plan that the EPA is putting forward to protect the public health. And again, we're urging all our Democrats to vote against it. Thank you, Javier.
Thanks, Frank. Congressman Ben Ray Lujan, New Mexico.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see everyone here today as well. And I think, as has been said by each of my colleagues, our prayers and our thoughts go out to all of the impacted families in Charleston, where one of our colleagues has been there all along, making sure that he's working with the families and offering his support as well, and our leader, Jim Clyburn. As we talk about impacts to families all across America as well, we're in the midst of conversations pertaining to how the government is going to be funded. Leader Pelosi this last week led a charge that many of us, if not all of us, were fully supportive of, and encouraging Republicans to start a conversation on how to prevent a government shutdown. And I think it's been pretty clear that, as we saw 4 years ago when Sequester came forward, an idea that was put on the table such that Democrats and Republicans knew how bad this was, that it was to prevent a meltdown. And yet today, as bad as we know that this program is, as much as it's hurting the country today, sadly, our Republican colleagues in the House refuse to move any legislation or allow us to lift sequestration, to get rid of it, to put it back into a bin that should be disposed of. And that's where sequestration belongs. We need to get to that point. So instead, they've offered a budget, and budgets after budgets, I should say, that include deep spending cuts while giving tax breaks to companies that continue to offshore jobs, all at the expense of investments that will help hardworking families grow their paychecks. And so rather than helping families get ahead, they're pushing them further behind, where the Democratic agenda is clear. We want to help families get ahead, and when they get ahead, we want them to stay ahead. And just to close, it's been clear that in the United States Senate, they're not moving forward with these reckless Republican appropriation bills. There's a better way to do this. And what we're asking for is for us to sit down and work together to make sure that we're doing what's right for the American people, lift sequestration, and bring back a responsible way to govern and look after the American people. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much to everyone here again. We look forward to continuing to visit with all of you.
Thanks, Ben Ray. We'll take a few questions. Yes, then we'll go with Mike.
I was hoping you could speak as to the caucus's position on the bill combining the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program and the various trade preferences programs. We've heard that the caucus is not taking a position and that the leadership won't be whipping. So hoping if you could elaborate on this and explain why, especially considering that these are two programs that the House Democrats have traditionally supported, and it's no longer tied to trade promotion authority.
If you'll recall, the Democratic leadership in the House has not taken a position of whipping on the trade bills because we have members who have taken a position of conscience on this, and some have voted for the trade bills, some have voted against them. And on these trade matters, I think the leadership has decided to allow members to move in the direction their conscience tells them to. We're also mindful that we're never certain what will come before us for a vote until the day of the vote, as Republicans in the House continue to juggle the agenda and the bills and don't inform us on the Democratic side of what they're actually going to put on the floor. So for those two reasons, one, because Republicans continue to hide the ball on trade, and two, because Democrats have taken strong positions on trade matters based on their own conscience, I don't think the leadership will be whipping this particular matter. And so what you'll find is that members will articulate their own position as we find out what might be before us in a vote as early as possibly tomorrow.
From the sentiments that were expressed at the meeting, would you expect if it was introduced today that the TA would pass?
And I'll let my colleagues join in answering. I think there's a great deal of concern about what exactly we're going to get. We were told we were going to get a particular sequencing and substance in bills on trade promotion authority, the fast track legislation. It turned out to be not the case. It turned out to be a different process that was used. And so I think a lot of members are going to wait to see what exactly we'll have before us on the floor. Many members, the majority of our members, voted against the TAA bill that essentially is coming back to us. Most of the members have voted for the Africa trade legislation, which the trade adjustment assistance legislation would be attached to, at least what we're hearing. And so it puts a lot of members in a very difficult position that Republicans are trying to figure out ways to game the system. So we're going to. I think a number of members are going to wait to see what exactly we have on the floor, so we can see exactly how we would want to vote. I don't know if anyone else wishes to.
I would just add to it. I think what's really coming out of our caucus is the fact that we talk about these trade agreements, and yet there's no discussion whatsoever on the floor about creating jobs right here in America right now. That's something that's frustrated, I think, Democratic members. I'm sure it's frustrated some of the Republican members as well. All this discussion, all this focus, all this debate on trade adjustment and on TPA, and TPP, and TAA, and T whatever at this point, and no focus whatsoever on affording opportunities for Americans right here to have jobs that are meaningful and that are career-orientated. I know, for one, I'd like to see us do a jobs bill. I want to see us do an infrastructure bill. I want to see us do a highway trust fund bill that invests once again in America. That's something that's coming out of that caucus loud and clear. In terms of the TAA, this has been a Democratic issue all along. Democrats are responsible for trade adjustment assistance in response in no small way because of the way in which American workers have been treated in past deals, where they've seen their jobs lost, or they've seen that what they have done and the career they established was move overseas, and they need the ability to be retrained and to get back into the workforce. I think it's something that's very held by the Democratic caucus as well, something we created and responsible for. And so I think that with the inclusion of AGOA, quite frankly, I intend on Thursday, if the vote comes up, to support the TAA.
Other questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Oh, Mike, I'm sorry. Mike.
Last week you said the TEA, that Democrats voted against it. I think both of you said that it was woefully inadequate. Is that still the case? And if so, why would you vote for something that's woefully inadequate in terms of workers' aid if the TPA is going to pass?
The bill is essentially the same as it was before. In my mind, it's still woefully inadequate.
We have raised on the committee as well here in the House the level itself. It's not a perfect bill at all. I do think that the bill is better, was made better by the change of the pay-for, and the work that the leader, Pelosi, had done, as well as the House Democratic Caucus to make those changes. I think now that the situation has changed, TPA will be signed, is what I believe. And I think what we have to do is stand up for the American workers here who will be displaced because of globalization, because of the trade agreement. They've been decoupled, basically. And I think we may not have another opportunity to do that, so I will support the TAA.
Mr. Chairman, you brought up the impending Supreme Court decisions that we're expecting in the next week. In the case of the Affordable Care Act case, it does come down to an interpretation of the law by the justices. Why can't there be a clarification of the intention of the law before now? Why do we have to wait for the Supreme Court?
We shouldn't have to wait. I think it's very clear what was intended by the law. Even our Republican colleagues who voted against it made it very clear what they believed the intention of the law was, which was to provide tax credits to all Americans, not just Americans in certain states. So for many of us, it's pretty obvious. If you've been through law school or have practiced law, as I have, you know that the rules for statutory construction would have you make sure that you interpret the statute so that it makes sense, not that it becomes nonsensical. And so I think it's pretty obvious where the Supreme Court should go. But watching the Supreme Court, it's become clear that they are as political an animal as any politician out there. And it's unfortunate because we used to believe that we could stand by the rulings of the 9 justices, even though they might be split, but that we would respect them because they were above politics. I hope that once again they prove that they are above politics and they do what would be in the best interest of the American public because it's the best way to interpret statutes. But we'll see. The Supreme Court oftentimes surprises us. There are human beings at the end of the day. We're just hoping they're not politically active human beings on the highest court of the land. Any final question? If not, thanks all very much.